Have you ever thought about where your food comes from or where your clothes come from? How the people who made these things are treated or the environmental impacts that they have? Well, if you're an ethical consumer, the answer is yes. But what exactly is ethical consumerism? Well, simply, it's a movement characterized by people making purchasing decisions based on whether or not a product was ethically sourced. So it's become a really prominent way for people to express either their content or their disdain with different brands or companies and how they're handling different social issues. So an example of this might be an ethical consumer might go into Starbucks and order a fair trade coffee. So it all sounds really fine and dandy and like this great thing. And based on just the name and what I just told you, it certainly does. But it's a lot more nuanced than that. So today I want to get into the complexities of ethical consumerism and explain to you why it isn't really a viable mode of social change and what other ways we can approach the issues that ethical consumerism claims to approach. Okay, so we first want to start off with a little bit of history. So ethical consumerism has really been around forever. Especially in terms of the US, we're talking about going back as far as like the Boston Tea Party a couple centuries ago to something a little bit more recent like the Delano grape strike in the 1960s. But what these have in common is that there's a social movement backing them. Contemporary ethical consumerism doesn't really have that element. It's more about social change directly through the marketplace. So the question of whether ethical consumerism is a social movement is kind of iffy. There certainly are people who take that extra step, but as a whole, what ethical consumerism has become is more about social change just through the marketplace. So next we want to move into what are the problems with ethical consumerism. So there are many, and I'll get into them, but first I want to show you an ad from 1971. It's from an environmental organization called Keep America Beautiful. And this has become a very infamous ad. It's known as the Crying Indian ad. You might have seen it before, but I think it illustrates everything wrong with the ethical consumerism movement.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't. People start pollution. People can stop it.
Right. So the point that ad is trying to make is really that the solution to things like these human rights and environmental issues that are imposed by these big corporations is individual decisions. And that's probably the biggest flaw with ethical consumerism, is this idea that an individual can solve the problem caused by these massive corporations. There's also the issue that ethical consumerism has made this idea that our consumption is related to our morals. So people have begun to associate this idea of whether they're a good or a bad person based on whether they buy ethically or unethically sourced goods. This is a major issue because people, especially, people who don't have the time and resources to dedicate to understanding where their products come from and stuff like that, if their morals are dependent on what they purchase, that kind of creates this issue where ethical consumerism has become a kind of virtue signaling. This is particularly true for more affluent young people who wouldn't otherwise be politically engaged, for them to both feel like they're politically engaged when they're really not doing the work, but also for them to kind of claim this moral superiority over other people who may not have the resources that they do. Also, when we're talking about the existence of ethically sourced goods, that implies the existence of unethically sourced goods. So just because you chose to purchase a fair trade coffee, that doesn't eliminate the issues that led to other coffees that may have been unethically sourced. It's not getting to the root of the problem. And this is one of the major issues of ethical consumerism, is that it's about, at its core, it's about human rights and it's about the environment, which is awesome, but it's approaching it in the wrong way. It's trying to approach these issues through the marketplace, which doesn't eliminate the issue at its core. And this kind of goes into my next point, which is an Elizabeth Klein quote. She's a journalist on sustainability, and she has a lot of good ideas on ethical consumerism. But what she had to say is that ethical consumerism has privatized a public issue. So it's taken the issue of human rights and the environment, and it's made it sort of this capitalistic thing. And what we really need to be doing is making public change through things like the voting process. So if you haven't figured it out by now, I kind of went into a little bit before, but ethical consumerism is very obviously classist. So now I want to point to a Nick Summers article. He is a sociology professor at Florida Atlantic University. And he, in his article, Ethical Consumerism and Global Perspective, pointed out that education is the number one deciding factor in whether someone is an ethical consumer. So these people, like I said, who may not have the same time and resources as others, won't be as likely to even know what ethical consumerism is or be able to take part in that movement. Looking at countrywide statistics, Norway has the highest percentage of ethical consumers with about 60%, but they have a GDP per capita of nearly 40%, while the Philippines has just over 10% ethical consumers, but a GDP per capita of about 5%. So if social change is taking place through the market, poor people aren't able to take part in that social change. What are the causes that lead to a movement like ethical consumerism? It's really about industry professionals who don't want to take accountability for their malpractices. So they make ads like the one that I showed you to make us feel like we're liable for their wrongdoing. Okay, so what are the solutions here? What are practical solutions addressing human rights and environmental violations in the products that we buy? The biggest thing that we can do is vote. That's the number one thing. We want to get involved. We want to get elected officials in office who will prioritize human rights and the environment over the interests of profits of these big corporations. There are also organizations who are working outside of the government. I want to point to one in particular, Behind the Brands. They kind of give corporations a different grade based on their level of ethics, and that helps consumers decide what brands to buy from, but it's also encouraged brands to take products out of circulation entirely if there's enough of an uproar about it, which is really awesome. What would a world look like where ethical consumerism isn't really a concern because everything is sourced ethically? We wouldn't feel this sort of moral weight on our shoulders for someone else's wrongdoing because we would know that human rights and the environment are coming before profits. So if we get out there and we vote people in who prioritize these things, we can have a better sense of peace knowing that things are a little bit better for workers' rights and for the environment. So what is it that you can do right now to help with this issue? Obviously, the number one thing is vote. Vote for people who, again, prioritize human rights and the environment over the interests of corporations. We want to get people in who believe in these things. When it comes to ethical consumption, I'm not encouraging you not to ethically consume if you can, but understand that that can't be your only thing. Lastly, just have conversations with the people around you about this stuff. It's really important that we do that kind of on the ground floor. So that kind of wraps everything up. I hope you learned something about ethical consumerism. I hope that you feel empowered, and I hope that next time you think about where your food or clothes come from, you think about the bigger picture.